Hi, welcome to our daily encounter. Today we read about Rehoboam taking the place of his father Solomon as king over Israel. And there comes a turning point at the very beginning of his rule. He has a decision to make. He can either decide to be harder on the people than his father was, or easier on the people. And he decides to be harder on them. He says, you know what, my father disciplined you with whips, I'll discipline you with scorpions. And that just turned everyone away from him. And so we see the division of the nation of Israel. And this division will carry on for hundreds of years. And so you have the northern tribes, which were made up of 10 tribes. And then you have the southern tribes, which made up the southern kingdom, made up of Judah and Benjamin. So the northern tribe is typically called Israel. And some of the prophets will call it Ephraim. Some will call it Samaria. But it's mostly known as Israel. And then the southern kingdom is typically known as Judah. And so it's split. And Rehoboam, after the split occurs and things kind of settle, Rehoboam becomes established and strong in his kingdom, in the southern part. But when this happens, as we typically see with a lot of these kings, whenever things are going good, he forsook the law of the Lord. Chapter 12 and verse 1 tells us. And so God sends Shishak, king of Egypt, up against Jerusalem. Well, when they see this king coming up against them with 1,200 chariots, 60,000 horsemen, they become pretty afraid and they humble themselves before the Lord. And so the Lord basically says, okay, well, I'm not going to destroy you. I'm going to give you some relief because you humbled yourself. But, verse 8, he wasn't going to take the oppression of Shishak completely away. He says in verse 8, but they will become his slaves, so that they may learn the difference between my service and the service of the kingdoms of the country. He says, okay, well, you don't want to serve me and you don't want to obey my laws. Well, how will you like it if someone else comes into your land and you have to serve their laws and obey them? And God is teaching them a lesson between what it's like to serve him and to serve other nations. They will learn this, and ultimately when they are exiled into Babylonian captivity. But they get a taste of it here with this Shishak, the king of Egypt. And I think that the Lord sometimes even does this for us today. We might get to a point in our walk with the Lord that we begin to drift. And we begin to sin against the Lord. Maybe we begin to become friends with the world. And we begin to buddy up with the world, even though the scriptures tell us not to love the world nor the things in the world. And how friendship with the world is enmity towards God. But yet we still warm up to the world. And maybe we even begin to commit the sins of the world. Well, God gives us over to those things. God sometimes gives us over to those things so that we can see what it's really like to live for the world. And to know the difference between living for the world and living for himself. One passage of scriptures that confuses people a lot of times is Romans chapter 1, where you have Paul talking about a time when God gives people over to sin. It says in verse 24, therefore God gave them over in the lust of their hearts to impurity, so that their bodies would be dishonored among them. In verse 26, for this reason God gave them over to degrading passions in other places. And so you think, well, God's letting them sin. God's giving them over to these things. Is he causing them to sin? No, what he's doing is he's saying, look, if you're rejecting me, go. I'm not gonna force you to be here with me, but you go out and you see where that leads you and where that takes you. And in Romans chapter 1, we see where it took them, because it gets down to the bottom in verse 28, and it says, just as they did not see fit to acknowledge God any longer, God gave them over to a depraved mind to do those things which are not proper, being filled with all unrighteousness, wickedness, greed, evil, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, malice, gossip, slanders, haters of God, insolent, arrogant, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, without understanding, untrustworthy, unloving, unmerciful. The bottom falls out morally with the people. And so they get a full taste of what it's like, what life is like without God. And I think that this happens to us personally, and I think also on a national level sometimes this occurs. We reject God, little by little we walk away from the Lord, and before we know it, and He allows us to do that, He allows us to walk away. And then, once we get in over our heads in the world and in the sin and all of the bad consequences that comes from sin, then we finally realize, okay, this is what life is like, living for the world, living for sin, living for Satan. It's destructive, it's unhealthy, and it leads to despair. And so sometimes God has to let us taste that. Sometimes God lets us go that direction so that we can be like the prodigal son, who would fain to eat the food that the pigs were eating before he came to himself. And sometimes we have to feast or start desiring the ugly things in this world and come to our senses and say, wait a minute, what I had with the Lord was so much better than what I have in the world. Sure, I may not be able to do everything that I want to do. Sometimes I have to not follow certain passions and desires, but boy, is it so worth it, because it guards me and it keeps me and it protects me from the evil, from all the bad consequences that come from following after the world, the sin and Satan. And so let's keep our ears tuned to that and our eyes tuned to that. Let's not drift too far away from the Lord. We already know that His Word shows us what life is like, enslaved to the world, to sin, and to Satan. And we've even tasted that to certain degrees. And let's let that be a lesson to us, that we don't want to go that direction. We don't want to drift away from the Lord. We want to be right next to our loving shepherd, the one who takes care of us, the one who leads us into green pastures beside still waters, the one who will care for us, take care of us, protect us, provide for us, the loving God that we have come to know. Let's not drift away from Him, not one step, but continually abide in Him and draw close to Him. Well, these are just some things to think about. I do thank you guys for listening in today. Hope you guys have a great day. Love you guys. God bless.